Have you ever wondered what it's like to be abandoned at the very moment you needed support most? What it's like to carry a life within you while your heart bleeds with the pain of betrayal? My name is Mary Collins. I'm 41 years old, and I never thought I'd be here, telling a story like this. I was that woman who believed she had everything under control: a structured family, a marriage founded on faith, a seemingly stable life in the eyes of the Christian community. But all it took was one moment, one painful revelation for everything to crumble. I was pregnant, full of hope for the future, when I discovered that the man I trusted, the one who had promised to be my companion before God and man, was no longer walking by my side. The betrayal wasn't just a mistake, it was a profound blow, capable of tearing the ground from under my feet. And as if that weren't enough, abandonment came, just a few months into my pregnancy. And there I was, alone, facing judgmental looks, listening to whispers that burned more than any direct words. Has anyone else here experienced this? Silence was imposed. They told me not to speak, only to pray. But how could I silence the pain that pierced me day and night? How could I hide the shame, the humiliation, the feeling of being left aside, even by those who claimed to love me in Christ? Get this. This revelation will leave you speechless. Because when I needed it most, I didn't find outstretched arms. I found closed doors. And yet, something inside me refused to die. There was a flame, small, almost extinguished, but real. A strength that said, "Keep going." With every tear, every sleepless night, I realized that this would not only be a story of pain, but also of faith, resilience, and new beginnings. Trust me, the ending is worth it. And that's exactly what I want to take you to now. If someone had told me years ago that I would be abandoned while pregnant, I would have laughed, perhaps even found it absurd. But that was my reality, a hidden truth that hit me when I least expected it. I believed I was living a stable life, with the family I'd always dreamed of building, rooted in the faith and Christian values I'd been taught since childhood. But behind this seemingly perfect image lay hidden secrets I didn't know about. Decisions being made out of sight, revelations that would later tear me apart. I clearly remember the first time I realized something was off. Small gestures that were once full of affection were replaced by coldness and silence. Dinner table conversations, which always ended in laughter, began to be interrupted by hasty apologies and unexplained departures. And even pregnant, even carrying within me such a powerful reason to stay together, I found myself increasingly alone. It's amazing how our minds try to deny the signs, as if ignoring them could push away the pain. But the truth has a cruel way of revealing itself. When I finally discovered the betrayal, it wasn't just the image of my marriage that shattered. It was my trust in humanity. It was the sense of security that seemed eternal. I found myself facing an inevitable transformation, thrown into a journey I hadn't chosen. The impact was so profound that even my faith, which had always sustained me, was challenged. Was God seeing me? Had I done something wrong to deserve so much suffering? These were questions that echoed within me like incessant hammers. And don't think the pain ended the moment he left. Abandonment was only the beginning. Then came the judgmental looks, the whispered words behind my back, the advice that hurt more than it helped. They told me to keep quiet, to accept it in silence, as if my voice had no value. It was as if my story had been forever stained, as if I were just the betrayed woman, the abandoned pregnant woman. The mindset of many around me was blind to my pain, only reinforcing a weight that was already unbearable. But amidst this devastating scenario, something began to stir within me, a deep desire to understand, to seek meaning, to find a path to rebuild myself in the ashes. That's when I realized that, despite the loneliness, I still had choices to make. I could give in to bitterness, or I could decide to walk toward a transformation I didn't yet fully understand. Let's explore the deeper side of this question together, because it's at this point in the journey that the story truly begins to take on another dimension. I've always been dedicated to my faith. From a young age, I found in church not only a space for prayer, but also a community that felt solid, safe, almost like an extension of my own family. It was there that I felt at home, surrounded by people who shared the same beliefs, the same mindset of hope and perseverance. I was married, believing I had a home built on firm foundations, sustained by promises before God and by dreams I believed unbreakable. I was certain that all of this would last forever, as if my life were a story, already written with chapters of peace and stability. Mornings at home were simple, yet full of meaning. The hurried coffee before work, the conversations about plans for the future, the feeling that we were together on a journey that, despite the challenges, would lead us to a happy destination. I believed in the little things, the gesture of holding hands before bed, the custom of praying side by side for divine guidance, the complicity that seemed to unite us. This was the image I had of my marriage, and it was one I trusted without hesitation. But looking back, I realized that we often live deluded by a beautiful version of reality, while behind the scenes hide revelations that only come to light later. It's hard to admit, but for a long time I ignored signs that might already have been there. Small mood swings, absences I justified with overwork, excuses that sounded too plausible to question. The hidden truth was already lurking in my life, but I didn't want to see it. It's strange how our minds, when consumed by love and trust, create mechanisms to protect the illusion that keeps us afloat. And so I continued to believe I was safe, that I had by my side not just a husband, but a companion in faith, someone who would walk with me through all the seasons of life. I dedicated myself intensely to church, organizing events, supporting other women, sharing words of encouragement. The impact of this was so great on me that I came to believe my life was an example of stability. How many times had I heard someone say, "Mary, you are an inspiration, proof that God honors those who are faithful," and I smiled, feeling that somehow my journey confirmed this mindset. But life, with its abrupt way of surprising us, was about to show me another side. Behind the walls of my home, while I nurtured the hope of a future with my family, something different was silently being built. Decisions were being made without my even realizing it, choices that would change everything I believed to be unshakable. I had no idea that, as I clutched my Bible in faith, my story was already being redrawn by hands other than my own. And it was in this contrast between the image of solidity and the hidden truth that my life began to transform. A painful transformation, one that would strip me not only of the certainties I held, but also of my trust in what I believed to be eternal. From then on, every gesture, every memory, every word takes on new weight, because it's when we look back that we can see the cracks that were there all along, even if we didn't have the courage to face them. And it's precisely at this point that my journey begins to reveal how much faith, no matter how strong it seems, can be shaken by what we don't see coming. And when I think back to those days, how much I believed I was living on solid ground, I realize how many of us carry similar stories, even if the details are different. Sometimes it's betrayal, other times it's abandonment, or even the silent judgment of those who've never walked in our shoes. That's why sharing this journey is so important to me. It's not just about reliving the pain, but about transforming that pain into something that can reach other women who may be going through the same thing. And here I want to open my heart to you, who are listening now. If this topic resonates with you, if my voice somehow touches something within your own story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Because your participation isn't just a simple gesture, it's what keeps this space going. It's what empowers messages like this to reach more people who need to hear that they are not alone. Your presence here creates a community of support, welcome, and renewed faith. And when you subscribe, it's not just to follow content, but to walk alongside me and so many others who are also seeking healing, hope, and transformation. Leave a comment with what's touched you most so far, because it's in these details, these outpourings, that we find true connection. It's incredible how a shared word can open paths of healing in another person. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And I believe this stream of real stories has a much greater impact than we imagine. And that's precisely why I continue, because each part of this journey reveals not only the pain, but also the seeds of something that was yet to come, something that would completely change the way I saw my own life. When I discovered I was pregnant, My heart overflowed with joy. I had already lived through so many phases of life, faced challenges, experienced losses and triumphs, but nothing compared to the feeling of carrying a life within me. I truly thought that this would be the most beautiful moment of my existence, as if all the pieces were finally falling into place. I imagined the future in vibrant colors, the decorated room, the sound of the first cries, the feeling of holding in my arms this being who was already changing everything within me. For me, it was more than just a child. It was a symbol of promise, of continuity, of a new beginning. I walked the streets with a smile that barely fit on my face, daydreaming about every detail. I thought about what the baby's eyes would look like, whether it would be my way or the father's way, and how our home would be filled with life. My prayers were constant, full of gratitude. I believed that pregnancy was a gift, a reward for all the years of fidelity, dedication, and patience. It was as if God had given me the chance to see my story gain a new chapter of hope. But behind this joy, there were already signs I didn't want to see. While my heart was making plans, while I was creating scenarios of happiness, the hidden truth was stirring in the background. A distance was beginning to grow between us, as if we were living in different dimensions. I insisted on believing. These were just phases, passing moments, but deep down, something inside me was already warning that decisions were being made without my knowledge. Still, I chose to cling to the dream because believing in love seemed easier than facing the possibility of loss. This mindset of denying reality was how I managed to preserve my peace for a while, because it's hard to admit that even in the midst of one of life's most beautiful phases, the cracks were already there, and I continued to harbor images of family reunions, of the child growing up in a loving home, of the memories we would build together. I believed that with the baby's arrival, everything would change for the better, that the impact of that new life would restore what had been worn down. It's curious how the human heart insists on painting hopeful scenarios even when the evidence suggests otherwise. I dreamed of seeing my husband vibrate with each heartbeat of the baby at our appointments, of feeling united around this news that would change our destiny. But instead, the absences became more frequent, the silences heavier, and I found myself trying to justify the unjustifiable. Still, I couldn't help but believe that this child would be the link capable of strengthening our bonds, the gift that would make us forget our failures and rewrite our history. And perhaps this was the most painful part, realizing that while I was living immersed in dreams, there was a parallel plot unfolding, invisible to my eyes. Plot made of secrets, hidden revelations, and choices that sooner or later would come to light and change everything. I believed that baby would be the beginning of a phase of fulfillment, but in reality, it was about to become the most intense turning point in my journey. But I began to notice that my husband was growing colder and more distant. Something wasn't right. At first, it was barely noticeable details, small things that anyone could explain away as tiredness or distraction. He would come home late, avoid long conversations, and seem to zone out when I talked about preparing for the baby's arrival. Before, his eyes would sparkle when we dreamed together, but now I saw only a lost look, as if his mind were elsewhere. It was as if there were an invisible barrier between us, something preventing me from reaching that heart that once seemed so close. I tried to deny this feeling, clinging to the mindset that marriages go through phases, that the impact of routine and work could justify his behavior. I often told myself that it was just a moment, that he would soon return to being the caring and present man he once was. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more evident the chasm that opened between us became. Words became rare, gestures of affection almost completely disappeared, and the house that once seemed full of life began to transform into a silent space, charged with attention I couldn't name. There were days when I watched him silently, trying to decipher what was going on behind the scenes. His short answers, his way of avoiding my gaze, his excuses for not being home, everything pointed to a hidden truth I still didn't want to face. It's curious how, when we love, we create justifications for what hurts, as if it were easier to harbor illusions than to face the pain of revelation. I wondered if it was my insecurity, if I was overreacting due to the changes of pregnancy. But deep down, I knew something deeper was happening. This realization brought with it a mixture of fear and hope. Fear of confirming what I feared, but also hope that it was just a temporary diversion. I tried to rekindle the flame, planned moments together, sought more intimate conversations, but always encountered a cold wall, a distance that seemed to grow even when we were side by side. Nights that were once filled with confidences and shared prayers became long silences in which I felt my heart cry out for answers. And it was precisely in this silence that I began to realize the devastating impact that emotional absence can have on a relationship, because it's not just overt betrayal that destroys, but also subtle neglect, the distance that slowly erodes trust. Every missing gesture, every unspoken word was like an invisible wound deepening within me. And as much as I tried to convince myself that everything would return to normal, something inside me already knew the journey was just beginning to reveal secrets that would change my life forever. The shock came like a knife. I discovered he had another woman, and it wasn't just a passing affair. It was something ongoing, structured, as if a parallel life were happening before my eyes without me even realizing it. My first reaction was denial. My mind refused to accept that the man with whom I'd shared years of life, dreams, prayers, and promises before God could carry such a cruel truth behind the scenes. It was as if, suddenly, all the certainties that sustained me had been ripped away at once, and I found myself falling into a void that seemed endless. The memory of that moment still resonates within me. The words I heard, the details that were revealed, every fragment of that revelation crushed me inside. It was impossible not to feel the physical impact of the pain, because it struck not only my heart, but my entire body. My knees trembled, my chest seemed to close, my breath became shallow. Betrayal has this power. It not only breaks trust, but destroys the image we build of the person we love. I looked at him and could no longer identify the man I knew, as if suddenly I had a stranger before me. The cruelest thing was realizing that it wasn't an isolated slip-up, but a series of repeated, sustained decisions filled with lies. It wasn't a mistake. It was a hidden lifestyle, a hidden truth sustained at the expense of my naivete. The weight of this realization left me in shock. I wondered how many times he'd left, how many excuses he'd made, how many nights I'd slept believing in our union, when he was actually somewhere else, with someone else. This avalanche of unanswered questions suffocated me and made the pain multiply. I remember thinking that if only it were temporary, perhaps there would be room for reconstruction. But realizing there was an ongoing involvement, a hidden life that had been dragging on for so long, was like feeling my entire marriage thrown into doubt. Did he ever truly love me? Did the words spoken at the altar have any meaning? This train of thought gnawed at me, as if it were dismantling piece by piece the story I believed to be true. And in the midst of it all, pregnancy became a cruel paradox. While I carried an innocent life within me, the fruit of love and hope, the child's father was immersed in lies and decisions that left me devastated. It was impossible not to feel betrayed, not only as a wife, but also as a woman who believed she was building a solid family. This mix of feelings left me lost, as if I were on a dark road, unsure of where to turn, unable to see a way out. It was at that moment that I painfully understood how betrayal affects not only the present, but also redefines the entire past. Suddenly, happy memories became suspect. Memories of special moments were tainted by doubt. It was as if every smile, every hug, every word spoken before the revelation had been tainted by deception. And this realization consumed me, because it wasn't just the loss of the future I dreamed of, but also the destruction of the memories I held dear. It felt like I'd lived in a theater, where I believed I was the protagonist of a love story, but in reality I was merely a spectator in a plot already manipulated behind the scenes. And it was this discovery that marked the beginning of a profound transformation, because there was no turning back. From that moment on, every decision I made would be weighed down by pain and the challenge of rebuilding something amidst the rubble. I wondered, how could a Christian man, a respected leader, do this to me? This was the question that hammered relentlessly in my mind. I looked at him and remembered the times he preached about fidelity, love, commitment to God and family, How many times had I silently boasted, thinking, "This is the man I chose, this is the father my child will have," and suddenly, this same man revealed himself full of contradictions, as if two versions of him coexisted, a public version, honored and admired, and a secret one, capable of betraying not only me, but also the very principles he preached. The pain was excruciating because it not only affected my wife's heart, it also affected my faith. It was as if a hidden truth had been brutally exposed, forcing me to face a cruel paradox. How could I trust words of love again when they all seemed fraught with deception? How could I believe in promises when those already made at the altar proved so fragile? This was the true impact of betrayal. It wasn't just losing a husband, it was losing the security of a built-up history. It was feeling like the ground had opened up and swallowed me whole. There were times when I found myself staring into the void, trying to process how life could change so quickly. A journey that, in my eyes, was heading toward family fulfillment suddenly became a landscape of rubble, and with each revelation, each detail uncovered, disbelief grew, along with the feeling that I had been living surrounded by illusions. It's painful to realize that the person you share your life with can, at the same time, be the author of your greatest wound. In the silence of the night, I sought answers from God, but even my prayers came out broken. The faith that had always been my foundation seemed to tremble, as if I were being tested to the limit. I wanted to believe there was a purpose, that nothing was beyond divine control, but the truth was, my soul was bleeding. I felt like someone walking through a storm without an umbrella, completely exposed, vulnerable, not knowing where to run. And even surrounded by people, the feeling was one of loneliness. I carried the pain in silence, because shame prevented me from crying out. How could I tell those who always saw us as a model couple that, behind the scenes, our lives were falling apart? How could I admit that my home, so praised by many, was actually a place of lies? These questions echoed within me, fueling not only the pain, but a kind of paralyzing disbelief, as if everything around me had lost its meaning. Little by little, I began to understand that this wasn't just a marital betrayal, but a profound rupture of identity. I no longer knew who he was, but worse still, I began to question who I was within that relationship. Everything I had built in terms of trust, love, and faith seemed to have shattered, and the reflection I saw in the mirror was of a woman trying to piece together fragments of herself. This was perhaps the hardest part of the whole process, realizing that it wasn't just him who had two versions, but that I also now needed to figure out who I would be after that revelation. A few months into my pregnancy, he told me he no longer wanted to be with me and walked out the door without looking back. I remember that moment as if time had stopped. I still held my belly as if I could protect my son not only physically but emotionally, trying to prevent that scene from becoming part of our history. The sound of the door slamming echoed within me in a way no words can describe. It was a silence filled with rejection, a brutal revelation that the man I had dreamed of growing old with had made his choice, and that choice didn't include me or the child growing inside me. It felt like I'd been dealt an unexpected blow in the midst of battle. I wasn't just dealing with betrayal, now I also had to face the imposed loneliness, the weight of abandonment at a time when all I needed most was support. It was as if my life had split into two parts, before that door closed and after. Before, I still harbored illusions, still believed that perhaps restoration was possible, but after, all that was left was to face the stark truth that he had decided to leave. The impact of this decision shook every aspect of my existence. My mind wavered between unanswered questions and memories that now ached like open wounds. I pondered every word spoken, every glance exchanged, trying to find clues that this outcome had been in the works for a long time, and I hadn't realized it. It was a futile search, but inevitable, because disbelief consumed me. And in the midst of it all, the pregnancy progressed, reminding me every day that I couldn't completely fall apart. There were times when I felt as if my identity had been ripped away. I was no longer a wife, no longer held the role of companion. I was left to be a mother, and a mother alone. This mindset that everything would now depend solely on me terrified me, and at the same time forced me to transform. It was as if life had thrust me into an unknown realm, full of uncertainty, but also of urgent decisions that needed to be made. I tried not to let resentment overwhelm me, but the underlying truth of the situation was that I felt discarded, as if my worth had been reduced to nothing. It wasn't just the marital bonds that had been broken, it was an entire narrative of the future that had been destroyed in seconds. This realization left me feeling grounded, and at the same time, it opened space for a kind of reflection I never imagined I'd experience. Because when everything around me crumbles, the only way out is to look within and try to discover where the strength to carry on comes from. And it was at that point, in that deep void where I found myself alone, that I began to realize that abandonment was not just the end of a relationship, but the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would reveal much more about me than I was prepared to face. I thought I would find support at church, but I was judged, met with harsh stares, whispered comments that hurt more than any direct words. I believed that space would be my refuge, that there I would find outstretched arms to welcome me at the most vulnerable moment of my life. However, the reality was different. The people who once called me sister in Christ now looked at me as if I had failed, as if the responsibility for the betrayal and abandonment was mine. The mindset seemed to be that I hadn't prayed enough, that perhaps I hadn't been a perfect wife, and that was why the marriage had collapsed. Each service became a challenge. I felt the weight of the revelations implicit in their expressions, as if everyone knew details I'd never shared. The low voices in the hallways, the malicious questions disguised as concern, it all made me feel exposed, almost as if I were on public trial. It was a kind of silent condemnation in which I was no longer seen as a woman of faith, but as the betrayed woman, the abandoned pregnant woman. It was as if my identity had been reduced to a single narrative, written not by me, but by those watching from the outside without knowing my inner workings. The greatest pain wasn't just being judged, but realizing the lack of empathy. People who should understand the value of forgiveness and acceptance chose to point fingers instead of offering a helping hand. I wondered how it was possible that so many spoke of love, but so few truly demonstrated it. This contrast was devastating because it also shook my trust in the community that for so many years I considered my spiritual family. It was as if the faith that sustained me had been used against me, transformed into a yardstick of judgment. This experience brought me a bitter revelation. The church, as an institution, doesn't always reflect the grace we preach. Often, what we see are mindsets shaped by rigid traditions, incapable of dealing with situations that deviate from expectations. I understood, at that moment, that I would need to make an immense effort to separate faith in God from human attitudes, because if I confused the two, I risked losing my footing completely. And this was one of the hardest decisions, not letting people's behavior distance me from what I still believed to be the greater truth. Even so, the feeling of being alone was real. I had to face the pregnancy, the abandonment, and now also the rejection of a group that was supposed to strengthen me. It was a deeply impactful journey because I not only lost my partner, but also the support network I imagined I had. I found myself at a point in my life where I needed to redefine everything: who I was, where I belonged, and where my strength would come from. And it was in this mix of pain and imposed silence that I began to understand that my path to transformation would be even longer and more painful than I imagined. Some said, "Don't talk about it, Mary. Pray in silence." But inside, I was screaming. The people around me seemed to believe that silence was the answer to everything, as if silence were synonymous with faith, as if swallowing pain were proof of obedience. I tried to follow this advice, trying to convince myself that keeping quiet was a wise decision, that perhaps it was the way to preserve my dignity amidst the scandal. But the truth is, every time I stifled my tears, every time I swallowed my words, the weight grew even heavier inside me. It was like carrying a suitcase full of stones, each one representing someone's expectations of how I should behave. There was a very clear mentality around me, that I should endure everything without complaining, without exposing the faults of those who hurt me. But the impact of this silence was devastating. I felt suffocated, as if trapped in an invisible prison, where the walls were built by the opinions and judgments of others. The prayers I said quietly in my room didn't seem enough to relieve the pressure. I needed to speak. I needed to name my pain. But every time I tried, someone came with that stern look, as if to say, "A woman of faith doesn't complain. She just prays and waits." This contrast between what I felt and what was imposed on me became unbearable. I wanted to scream, but I was silenced. I wanted to cry in public, but I was reminded to maintain my composure. Behind the scenes of my life, I was shattered, but before the eyes of the community, I needed to appear serene. This dichotomy consumed me, because it was like living in two worlds at once: the world of hidden truth, where I faced the real consequences of abandonment, and the world of facade, where everything had to appear bearable. As the days went by, I realized that this silence wasn't just a behavioral choice, but a way of nullifying myself. It was as if my voice had been ripped away, as if my suffering had to be hidden so as not to disturb. And this brought me a painful revelation. When a woman is silenced, she loses not only the opportunity to express herself, but also part of her identity. I no longer knew if I was the strong, serene Mary everyone expected, or the real Mary, who simply wanted to break down without fear of judgment. This journey taught me that imposing silence can be as cruel as the betrayal itself, because it doesn't allow the wound to be exposed and heal. It forces me to secretly carry a pain that only grows. I faced a difficult choice: continue to hide my screams or begin to challenge the pattern that suffocated me. And it was at that point that I realized that, even without speaking out loud, the scream was already echoing within me, ready to transform into something no one could ignore. It was as if the blame had been thrust upon me. I felt invisible, small, stained. With every sidelong glance, every insinuated comment, I felt like I had a label stamped on my forehead. It wasn't just the weight of abandonment, but also the cruel judgment that seemed to make me responsible for everything that had happened. As if I hadn't prayed enough, as if I hadn't been a good enough wife, as if the fault lay solely with me. This mindset was overwhelming because it forced me to fight not only the pain of betrayal, but also the distorted narrative surrounding me. There were days when I found myself trying to hide, avoiding leaving the house, fearing the curious glances that followed me wherever I went. Shame seemed to corrode my identity, as if it had tarnished not only my marriage, but also my worth as a woman and a Christian. It was humiliating to realize that, while I tried to survive the storm, many watched me as if my life were a behind-the-scenes show, a soap opera full of revelations and exposed secrets. I was seen not as someone in pain, but as the protagonist of a story that fueled malicious commentary. The impact of this phase was profound, making me question even my own dignity. I would look in the mirror and no longer recognize the woman reflected there. Where was Mary, secure, confident, and full of faith? What remained was a weakened version, marked by feelings of inadequacy and failure. It was as if each judgmental word had ripped away a piece of my self-esteem, leaving me with only the rubble of a shattered identity. And yet, amidst all this pain, something within me began to awaken. An inner voice, still timid but insistent, reminded me that the shame was not mine to bear, that the guilt did not belong to me, even though so many tried to place it on my shoulders. This realization was like a spark of light in the darkness, because, by recognizing the injustice of the situation, I began to realize that humiliation would only have power over me if I accepted it as truth. Of course, it wasn't an instant process. The journey was marked by ups and downs, moments when I felt strong enough to hold my head high, and others when the weight of shame made me shrink back down. But it was in this back and forth that I realized that transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's built step by step, decision by decision. And I had to decide every day whether I would let myself be defined by what people said, or whether I would seek the strength to reframe that experience. This internal conflict between the voice of external judgment and the need to find a new mindset was one of the most challenging periods of my life, because it wasn't just about surviving the pain, but about rebuilding an identity that wasn't shaped by humiliation. It was at this point that I realized the real battle wasn't just against betrayal and abandonment, but against how I would choose to see myself from then on. How would I raise a child alone at 56? How would I support myself? How would I face the world? These questions swirled in my head. It was as if each dawn came with a flood of uncertainty, revealing the hidden truth I'd avoided facing during the day. I felt the weight of age, the impact of circumstances, and the fear of not being able to do it all. Women are taught to be strong, but in that moment, I felt broken, doubting my ability to handle it all. With each movement of the baby inside me, my heart filled with love, but also with profound fear. What would become of our lives from then on? There was no longer a partner by my side, the support network I believed existed, and the community that was supposed to support me was busy judging me. I felt like someone left in the middle of a desert, without direction, without resources, forced to make decisions that seemed too big to bear. I remember nights when I would do mental calculations, thinking about how to stretch my money, how to organize a routine, how to juggle everything without completely losing my sanity. Anxiety followed me like a shadow, reminding me at every moment that I couldn't fail, because not only my life was at stake, but also that of a helpless being who depended on me for everything. This awareness paralyzed me while simultaneously pushing me forward. It was a paradox, feeling afraid of the future, yet at the same time compelled to walk toward it. Abandonment left me facing an abyss of responsibility. I needed to reset my mindset, because if I let myself be driven solely by dread, I would never have the strength to move on. And that's when I realized that fear, though painful, also carries within it a revelation. It exposes the depth of what truly matters. My fear of the future wasn't just about paying bills or being alone. It was about not disappointing that little being who would come into the world without having asked for anything. It was about not losing myself completely amid the scars of betrayal. There were times when I imagined what it would be like to face stares at school, doctor's appointments, and sleepless nights. I considered the physical and emotional impact of becoming a mother at a stage in life when many are already considering slowing down. Comparing myself to other women my age hurt even more. While many were planning trips and retirement, I found myself preparing bottles, diapers, and sleepless nights. It was a brutal reality check, as if my journey had been ripped from its original path and taken on a completely unexpected path. Yet, amidst this chaos, a flame refused to go out. Perhaps it was maternal instinct. Perhaps it was a still timid faith trying to survive. But something inside me told me that, despite the fear, I had to keep going. It was a silent transformation, born of desperation itself, of the very feeling of being on edge. And it was in this mixture of dread and courage that I began to understand that the future, though uncertain, could not be avoided. It would come anyway, and it would be up to me to decide how to face it. There were nights when I cried until I had no tears left, asking God, why me? The darkness seemed to swallow me, and even surrounded by the silence of the house, it was as if a whirlwind screamed inside me. I curled up in bed, hugging my stomach, and felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces each time reality hit me again. The weight of loneliness was so great it felt suffocating, and I often questioned whether I could bear it. When the pain is so intense, the mind begins to play with us, conjuring up thoughts we never imagined. Shame, fear, the feeling of failure, everything mixed together in a bitter broth that made me believe I had lost control of my own life. It was like being in free fall, with nothing to hold on to. What hurt most was realizing that, as I plummeted, the world kept spinning. People went about their daily lives, and I seemed frozen in time, trapped by the impact of everything that had happened. With each sleepless night, I searched for an answer that never came. My prayers were more moans than words, and it felt like my cries were lost in the void. This was the period when I felt most invisible, as if my pain were too great for those around me to notice. At times, I even tried to wear a mask during the day. I forced smiles, feigned stability, as if I could convince the world and myself that I was fine. But behind the scenes, the story told a different story. At rock bottom, no disguise lasts long. The body gives signals, the mind tires, and the heart can't handle so much pressure without overflowing. And I burst into tears almost every night, trying to relieve at least some of the weight. This period brought me bitter revelations. I realized how easy it is to lose yourself when everything you believed in crumbles. I also realized that pain isn't just the result of one event, but of the entire chain of decisions, expectations, and illusions that build up until they explode. The hidden truth I needed to face was that I was broken, not just because of him, but because I had placed the foundation of my security in someone else. That was the point at which I understood that, to escape that place, something deep inside me would need to change. But, at that moment, there wasn't enough strength to transform. All that existed was the crushing weight of hopelessness. The journey seemed too long, and I couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. But paradoxically, it was in this place of greatest fragility that something began to stir within me, even if I didn't immediately realize it. Because even at the bottom of the pit, there's always a breath of life that insists on remaining. And it was this breath that little by little began to show me that my story wasn't over yet. But it was precisely in this desert that I heard God's gentle voice. "I never left you, Mary." That phrase came not in a thunderclap or a grand revelation, but in an intimate, almost imperceptible whisper that reached my weary heart. I was so immersed in grief that it seemed impossible to believe in any promise of hope. Yet, it was in that moment that something changed. Not because the circumstances around me had suddenly transformed, but because within me a spark of life was rekindled. It was as if, amidst the chaos, I had found an invisible anchor, something that reminded me that, despite being rejected by those who promised love, I was still loved by the creator of my story. This revelation didn't erase the pain immediately, but it brought a new perspective. The impact was like seeing a small ray of light at the end of a dark tunnel. I realized that, although I had lost much, I hadn't lost everything. The life forming within me was proof that there was continuity, that there was something to be protected and cultivated. And in that moment, I understood that I needed to get up, albeit with shaky steps, and begin a new journey. This decision wasn't easy. It wasn't the result of an impulse, but a silent process marked by tears, questions, and sleepless nights. But every time I remembered the gentle voice that said, "I never left you," it was as if I gained a little more strength to carry on. I began to question the mindset I'd carried up until that point. How many times had I placed my security in people, in institutions, in human expectations? It was hard to admit, but I'd placed my heart on a fragile pedestal. Now, faced with the hidden truth that had been revealed, I needed to learn to rebuild from a different foundation. It was a turning point because I could no longer live the same way. It was as if God was calling me to look beyond the pain, to see that every decision from then on would have the power to redefine not only my present, but also the future I would build with my son. This awakening didn't mean everything became easier immediately. The abandonment still hurt, the judgment still wounded me, the loneliness still weighed heavily. But from that moment on, I began to realize there was a purpose hidden behind the scenes of my pain. Every tear, every wound, every night of silence was being used to shape something within me that I didn't yet fully understand. And it was in this process that I realized it wasn't just a matter of surviving, but of learning to transform. The transformation wouldn't come from outside, it wouldn't come from the people around me, but from the daily decision to believe that, even amidst the chaos, there was a God who remained. And so, with still hesitant steps, I began this new phase. A phase in which it was no longer enough to simply endure, but to choose, every day, to look forward. It was in this place of fragility and, at the same time, of revelations, that I understood. My story wasn't over, and perhaps what seemed like the end was, in fact, the beginning of something I never imagined I would experience. I began to read the Word with new eyes. Each verse seemed to lift me off the ground. Before, the scriptures were part of my routine, a habit of faith cultivated for years. But now, amidst the chaos, they became food, air, almost medicine for the soul. It was as if I were reading for the first time what had passed before my eyes so many times. Texts that had previously sounded distant now became personal revelations, direct answers to my most intimate questions, words of comfort, of promise, of life, reached me as if they were written precisely for me, precisely for that moment. I clung to every promise, like someone holding onto a twig in a flood. The days were still heavy, the memories of abandonment still hurt, but there was something different inside me, a quiet, silent strength that grew with each sincere prayer. And, curiously, I realized that the more I poured myself out before God, the more I could see my pain from a new perspective. It wasn't just suffering. There was a process underway, a transformation happening behind the scenes of my soul. It was a curious contrast. On the outside, I still faced judgmental looks, still carried the practical difficulties of being pregnant and alone at 56, still faced with seemingly impossible decisions. But on the inside, something was being built, brick by brick, silently. It was as if, with each verse that penetrated my heart, a part of my identity was restored, and I began to understand that faith was not a shield to protect me from pain, but a strength to sustain me within it. The mentality I'd previously harbored, that I needed to appear perfect, that I should remain silent and resigned, began to give way to a new way of thinking. I understood that being strong didn't mean not crying. It meant crying and still getting up. It meant facing the harshest revelations and still moving forward. This realization had a profound impact on the way I saw myself. For the first time in a long time, I began to believe that perhaps I wasn't just the victim of a cruel story, but the protagonist of a journey that still had much to teach. This rediscovery of faith was like lighting a flame in the darkness. I was surprised to realize that the more I immersed myself in the Word, the less alone I felt. It was as if each chapter of Scripture reminded me that my story wasn't adrift, that there was someone guiding every step, even the most painful ones. And little by little, that strength that previously seemed non-existent began to manifest itself in small actions. Getting out of bed even when I didn't want to, facing people even when I was embarrassed, continuing to dream about the future even when I carried scars. It was at this point in my journey that I understood something that would forever change my outlook on life. Faith is not just a comfort for the weak, but a call to transformation for those who choose to stand firm. And this discovery began to shape in me a courage I never thought I possessed. I understood that I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide how to react from then on. This awareness didn't come immediately, but rather as a slow, almost painful process of facing the truth without masks. For a long time, I had harbored the illusion that if I had done something differently, perhaps the outcome wouldn't have been so cruel. I wondered, if I had spoken less, cared more, prayed more fervently, would everything have been different? But deep down, I knew that this kind of thinking only kept me trapped in a chain of guilt that wasn't mine to bear. The hidden truth was that He had made His choices, and I could no longer take responsibility for decisions that were never mine. This recognition had an immediate impact on my heart. It was as if, by accepting that I had no power over the past, I finally made room to see the present with new eyes. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a weight dragging me down. It was a mark that reminded me that I survived. This shift in mindset was liberating, yet frightening, because it meant abandoning the role of victim and taking on the responsibility of writing a new story. Not a story chosen by me under ideal circumstances, but one born from the rubble, full of scars, but also of possibilities. Accepting reality didn't mean forgetting what happened, much less romanticizing the pain. It meant looking squarely at what was destroyed and still deciding to build again. It meant admitting that I wouldn't have the perfect marriage I dreamed of, that I wouldn't have the family life I'd planned, but that this didn't define my worth. The impact of this decision was profound, because it brought with it a sense of autonomy I'd never experienced before. I realized that even at 56, abandoned and pregnant, I could still choose how to react. And this choice had the power to transform not only my future, but also the way I saw myself. It was at this point in my journey that I began to see the behind the scenes of my own life more clearly. I saw the woman who cried until she had no tears left, the woman who was silenced, humiliated, judged, and also the woman who, against all odds, was still standing. This revelation filled me with a kind of unexpected courage, because if I had already endured so much, why not believe I could endure? What was yet to come? Acceptance showed me that there was no longer room for fantasies, but there was room for conscious decisions. It was as if I were clearing the ground of my soul to plant something new, something I didn't yet know what it would be, but which was already born, charged with purpose. And although there were still days when fear knocked on the door, I no longer saw it as an enemy, but as a reminder that I was alive, walking, starting over. This shift in perspective was the key that allowed me to take the first steps toward a new phase, where I would stop simply surviving and finally begin to live. I stopped living to please people and started living to please God. This decision seems simple when said out loud, but in practice, it was one of the greatest revolutions of my life. I had spent so much time conforming to other people's expectations, trying to fit into imposed standards, that I no longer knew where my identity ended and the image created by others began. When judgment came with all its force, when I was placed in a place of shame and questioning, I realized that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough to satisfy the critical mindset of those who only know how to point fingers. It was at that moment that I understood. Living for human eyes was living in prison, but living for God was experiencing true freedom. The change began with small gestures. I stopped worrying about the sidelong glances during services, the whispered comments. In the hallways, the veiled advice that hurt more than helped. I began to see that the hidden truth behind much of what they called care was actually judgment in disguise. And when I stopped giving power to these external voices, a huge weight lifted from my shoulders. It was as if I finally understood that the real impact of my life was not on the approval of men, but on how I responded to God's call in the midst of pain. This decision didn't erase the comments or silence the criticism, but it radically changed how they affected me. Before, each word was like an arrow plunging deep into me. Now, they barely grazed me because I no longer defined myself by them. I discovered that overcoming judgment doesn't happen when the world changes, but when our mindset transforms. And this revelation brought an unexpected strength, the ability to embrace my own story with all its flaws, failures, and scars, without needing to hide anything to appear perfect. It was liberating to understand that pleasing God didn't mean living by rigid rules, but choosing integrity, faith, and love daily. This new way of seeing gave me the courage to face not only the community that judged me, but also my own fears and insecurities. And little by little, I learned to walk lighter because I no longer had to carry the burden of being what was expected of me. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could breathe without fear of disappointing anyone. This turning point became a milestone in my journey. It wasn't just a reaction to abandonment or imposed silence, but a conscious decision about who I wanted to be from then on. And it was in this process that I realized that when we stop living for others, we begin to truly live. And this was just the beginning of a transformation that would continue to amaze me. Looking at my baby growing inside me gave me a reason to fight and keep going. Each beat of that little heart was like a reminder that life still pulsed, that even amidst the pain, there was something precious that needed me. It was curious to realize how, at a time when I felt so fragile, I simultaneously discovered a strength I never imagined I had. Motherhood, which initially seemed like an impossible burden to carry alone at 56, became the fuel that kept me going when everything inside me wanted to collapse. There were days when fear paralyzed me, but all it took was feeling the movement inside my belly to remind me that I couldn't give up. That innocent being depended entirely on me, and this truth, however harsh, also brought clarity. There was no room for losing myself in the voices of judgment, nor for drowning in shame. I needed to focus on the impact my decisions would have on my son's life. It was a call to responsibility, but also a revelation. The pain of abandonment had pushed me to the brink, but motherhood was pulling me back to the surface. It was during this process that I began to see my journey differently. Motherhood didn't erase the suffering, but it gave meaning to my resistance. It was as if God had planted within me not only a new life, but also the courage to face the behind the scenes of my story. And the more I connected with this reality, the more I realized something transformative was happening. I, who had seen myself as a victim, was discovering the possibility of becoming a protagonist, of rewriting the narrative not from abandonment, but from the love that was born within me. Every doctor's appointment, every preparation, every small detail of the pregnancy became a symbol of hope. I no longer looked only at the loss, but at the future that was being built. Sure, there were still nights of tears, moments of doubt, but motherhood served as a beacon in the midst of the storm, reminding me that life wasn't over. It had simply taken an unexpected turn. This shift in mindset was decisive because it made me realize that motherhood wasn't just a responsibility, it was also an opportunity for transformation. And it was in this contrast between pain and hope that I understood something essential. Abandonment had knocked me to the ground, but motherhood was teaching me to get back up. My son wasn't even born yet, and he was already the reason for my new beginning. And this revelation would forever change the way I would approach the next chapters of my journey. I thought I'd lost everything, but I discovered that, with God, I still had everything I needed. This was the revelation that transformed the way I saw my own life, because at first, all I could see was absence. Absence of love, absence of support, absence of understanding. I looked back and saw only ruins, as if nothing remained of what I once dreamed of building. But little by little, I realized that amidst the rubble, there was still something unshakable, something no one could steal, God's presence, and the promise that He would not leave me alone. This was the foundation that kept me going, even when my strength seemed to have run out. Understanding this wasn't just a comfort, it was a turning point in my mindset. I learned that loss doesn't always mean the end. It's often just the beginning of a profound transformation. The hidden truth that once pained me so much now revealed itself as an opportunity. I no longer needed to live according to other people's expectations, nor try to carry guilt that wasn't my own. I could choose to live with purpose, with courage, and above all, with faith. This decision impacted not only me, but also the future of my son, who was growing within me as a symbol of hope and continuity. It was through this process that I understood that pain can become a teacher, that the behind-the-scenes moments of our story, those moments no one sees, are precisely those that most shape our essence. Because it is in solitude that we learn to hear God's voice. It is in weakness that we discover true strength. It is in loss that we understand the value of what truly matters. This journey was not easy, but it gave me a different perspective on life, that our identity is not defined by what happens to us, but by how we choose to react to it. And if I share this story today, it's because I believe it can reach hearts that, like mine, have felt broken, discarded, or invisible. Perhaps you've also experienced the weight of abandonment, the judgment of others, the imposed silence that suffocates. Perhaps you found yourself in dark nights without the strength to carry on. But I want you to know, there is hope. There is a path to healing, even when all seems lost. And it is precisely in these desert moments that we can find revelations that change our path forever. If this story spoke to your heart, share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Let's create a safe space together where women can find healing, hope, and faith. This is more than a personal story. It's an invitation to walk side by side, transforming pain into purpose and silence, into voice. Because in the end, it doesn't matter what was taken from you, but what you decide to do with what you still have. And believe me, with God, you will always have everything you need to start over.